So we've reached the final part of Chapter 23, Standard Costing and Variance Analysis. And as mentioned in Part 5, this last section is fairly straightforward, fairly manageable. Really, we've gone from a consideration of what standard costing is through a series of variances, broadly speaking, becoming slightly more complicated as we went from sort of sales variances through to the fixed production variances. And then we considered the operating statements where we sort of control things. You know, we look at a statement that allows us to sort of reconcile between budgeted and indeed actual figures. Here in this final part, what we're going to consider is, how do we analyze variances and indeed the purpose of them and what sort of techniques are in play and what's important and what isn't. This is section 7 within the Study Hub. So let's take a look at the first area, investigations. Really, when we think about variances, we know how important this is in terms of the sort of the three-part definition of management accounting: planning, controlling, and indeed decision making. So this area of variances is certainly in the first part, the planning, i.e. with the standards, and then moving through the controlling and the decision making, because really what we're looking to do is say, well, what are the differences and where are they? And what do they mean to us? What should we do, if anything? So in terms of areas we should consider, or aspects, if you will, certainly significance is important. Now, you might read sort of significance size. Yeah. So bottom line is that in terms of variances that are large, certainly an organization will have to target them. The larger the variance, the more the concern. So really, in essence, significant variances are obviously more important than sort of minor or negligible variances. Second area for us is really control. Now, clearly, when we look at, for example, operating statements or variance analysis reports, we're interested in being able to control variances, particularly adverse variances. So if there's a certain variance, for example, material usage, we may be looking to see, okay, it's very, very high. What are the reasons? Can we do something about it, for the next period? Linked into that, really the idea of elimination. I guess the earlier that we get to a variance, the earlier that we consider, oh, there's a problem in this area, be it labor, materials, sales, etc., then there's a chance going forward we can eliminate it. Outside of that, a common thread within MA, we've heard this several times before, and indeed you'll hear it going forward in your ACCA studies, the idea of cost v benefit. What we can't do is expend a lot of time on variances, significant or otherwise, where the sort of upside or the benefit is really so much lower than the cost of getting involved in this investigation. Okay? So moving from there, those 4 key aspects, if you will. Now, in terms of the planning and control cycle, I've mentioned the definition of management accounting several times. Where does this area fit in the broad scheme of things? Well, as you sort of guessed, and if you remember back to the diagram that we saw, the diagram is shown within the Study Hub Chapter 23. I guess the first area is measuring actual results. Certainly, what we need to have is accurate measurements of what has happened within the budget period so that we can compare them to the budget or the plan for the same period. Now, once we do the comparison, clearly, we're going to be calculating differences or calculating variances and producing some form of variance report, as mentioned previously. Now, here we come into play one of the aspects we saw above, first one, investigating significant variances. And note it says large enough to require investigation. What we don't want to do is to spend a lot of time investigating every single variance. Outside of that, I guess, final point, as it were, acting on variances. The bottom line is that it may well be that something within the variance analysis report, the operating statement, draws us to the conclusion that actually, it wasn't so much performance or actuals, it was really something we got wrong from the off. Maybe budgets need to be realigned. Maybe they need to be adjusted. Okay. So there's the sort of broad picture, as it were. Let's move on from there. Excuse me. In terms of a variance analysis report, now this is different to an operating statement. Variance analysis report, pretty straightforward. We're simply looking to support the operating statement by breaking down variances. As we'll see in part 2 of the branch here, variances will be summarized in a control report presented to management along with perhaps findings, conclusions, or indeed recommendations. Okay? So, in essence, what we're saying is that this whole area of investigating and analyzing variances comes in several different parts. We've got to have accurate information, we've got to produce reports, and then we've got to spend time analyzing those reports. Note that in terms of analysis, clearly there may well be a relationship between one variance and another variance. So, for example, a favorable variance may be directly related to an adverse variance. I'll give you an example here in relation to a material price variance, 1575 favorable, and indeed looking at that as percentage 10.29. So let's just say the favorable materials price variance of 1575 is directly related to an adverse material usage variance of 450. Let's say a cheaper type of plastic F was purchased in 2x5. So you can see how some variances can be interlinked. Okay? Moving from there, in terms of detail here, the causes for variances is something that I've emphasized really from the off, part 1 with sales. And here what we have, I think, is a very, very useful summary for us for the exam. I've simply cut and pasted this out. It was quite a job, I can tell you, to get this into the mind map, that's for sure. But there's a useful little summary, and everything that we'll see within this particular diagram is going to be relevant for the exam. This is a great little summary. Remember what I said in terms of variances, calculations and causes. Okay, so please do consider using this particular diagram, if not each of the individual elements within each variance. Make sure you're on top of the causes. They're going to be examined. Okay. So that concludes this particular chapter. Quite a few parts. As mentioned from the off, we split it into 6 just to make it a little bit more manageable because it's long and it's a little bit tricky in places and a lot of images too. I hope you found that run through helpful and that your studies are going okay. Many thanks for listening.